Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome to So Many Books, So Little Time. My name is Joe Nash, and I'm here with Zina Shevchik. We're both librarians here at the Colonie Library. And in case you don't know what we do here, the premise is very simple. We go down to the new bookshelf, and we go to our technical services department where all the new books are being processed. We brought up a whole bunch of new books, and we're going to tell you about them. And as usual, Zina will be going first. So Zina.
Okay. Just a little added note that we tend to pick things that aren't necessarily on the bestseller list. We won't generally highlight a Danielle Steele book or something like that. So we pick something out a little bit more unusual that you might not know about. This is fantastic. Now, I just looked at it this morning. It's called What I Eat Around the World in 80 Diets instead of 80 Days, 80 Diets by Peter Menzel and Faith DeLucio. Peter Menzel is a photojournalist, so it's basically a photographic collection. They visited 30 different countries and talked to 80 different people, and they asked them to display and list and be photographed with all the food and drink they had in one day. And it's actually fascinating. The photographs are obviously, they're beautiful, again, from every walk of life. But it's also to see the different amounts as well as different kinds of food people in different cultures eat. It portrays, well, it highlights people from very active occupations, like oil rig workers. There's a bicycle messenger in a city, people like that, or people on a fishing boat, who obviously are moving at just about every minute of the day. And then they also highlight people who sit at a desk every day. And some of it's predictable, but some of it isn't. It's arranged by the amount of calories these people eat. So the smallest number of calories a day is like 800 calories a day, and the highest was something unbelievable. I can't remember whether it was 5,800 or no, 8,400. Here we go. 8,400 calories a day was the highest. The lowest was, I should have remembered this, but I don't. I didn't.
That book, we say it's 80 diets. They're not diets for losing weight. You mean they're
no,
a person's
what
diet.
People eat,
okay.
right?
That's
what people eat around the world. This is 800. Oh, it's a Maasai herder. Someone, can you believe that? The Maasai herder? Well, I suppose the herder maybe stays still more than, I think of the Maasai in Africa, of trekking.
Yes.
They're nomads, right? And they have the most amount of calories was, I think, by someone in England who's just, it's a compulsive eating. It's like 12,000 calories. The next one was a trucker, Trans-Kalahari trucker, 8,400 calories. That's Namibia, which is in Africa. But the photography is amazing. And you learn all about just the daily life of all sorts of different people around the world. And again, I just glanced at it this morning, but I was so taken by it, I thought that you might like to know about it. So, What I Eat Around the World in 80 Diets.
All right. Well, I know that the bicyclers, like during the races, eat like 15,000 calories a day. So, I don't know.
Sounds good to me.
Well, usually when we talk about our books here, we usually try to talk about them from reading reviews or reading the inside flap or sometimes skimming them. But here's a book I actually read. I just finished because I was off last week. I was able to finish it, so it's kind of a long book. It's a biography of Somerset Maugham. It's a brand new book, absolutely fascinating. The Secret Lives of Somerset Maugham. by Selena Hastings. Selena Hastings wrote biographies of Nancy Mitford and Evelyn Waugh. I think the Waugh one won many awards. But even if you don't know that much about Somerset Maugham or read many of his books, it was an absolutely fascinating life. He lived from 1874 to 1965. So he goes from the Victorian era. 1870s is still Victorian, right? I
Yes.
think. He goes from the Victorian right up until 1965, and he wrote almost until maybe the last 10 years of his life or so. So it's a fascinating portrait of that era. He knew everyone that was everyone, people in the movie industry and theater and literary world, like Winston Churchill he used to hang out with, and he lived in this Riviera, and he lived on this mansion in the Riviera. Everyone who was anyone visited him, and some of the descriptions of what the goings on there are very interesting. But the thing about Somerset Maugham is most interesting is he's one of the few people where his fiction and his life really intersect. I mean, almost all his stories and novels were almost, I don't want to say they're true 100%, but they're really extremely autobiographical. Of course, Of Human Bondage, his most famous book, is, it's probably 98% autobiographical. And he was known for a lot of times, particularly in the short stories, for not even changing people's names, I think. I mean, the first names stayed the same, so he didn't really disguise it. And he got into trouble a few times. But he was also a very famous playwright. He would have 3 or 4 plays at once going, both in London and New York. And he was, from this book, I always thought, well, he's pretty famous. But he was absolutely world famous. Everyone knew him everywhere he went. He was the most famous author in the world. He has sort of been, I don't want to say he's been forgotten, but he said he knew where he stood. He said something like, his famous quote was, I am at the head of the class in the second rank. So he sort of knew that he wasn't like a totally literary. He was always not condemned. He was always taken to task for being popular, but he was immensely popular. He sold his stories to every magazine around. His short stories are world famous. So anyway, the book was fascinating. It goes into everything about his life of W. Somerset Maugham. It's a really good book, The Secret Lives of Somerset Maugham by Selena Hastings. Zina?
I remember reading Of Human Bondage and how much that inspired me. I mean, it was really affecting.
Oh yeah, when you read the book.
It affected me when I read that book, and I think I was a young adult. And
yes,
that was one of the books that I.
It's almost totally
clearly.
Autobiographical, and he had a really tough upbringing, and
Right.
so stuff from his childhood affected him his whole life. But really fascinating guy.
Yep. Okay, my next book is called 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. This is kind of segues from my other book about food. This is about a street in Lower East Side of Manhattan. There's actually a museum there right now. It's called the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And this book is a social history, food history. It describes 5 real families who lived in this tenement building between 1863 and 1935. So one of the families was German, one Irish, one Italian, and there were 2 families that were East European Jewish. And it tells their story in terms of what they ate, what they cooked, how they got their food, the development of different kinds of stores and food peddlers on the street. It talks about how the women in particular had to walk up and down the stairs, multiple times a day to get the food up, get the water up to clean and cook with, and how the children helped with that, and how they learned great technique in one-pot cooking because of the lack of indoor plumbing and the lack of refrigeration. And it's fascinating. It talks about how some of the food myths it debunks some of the food myths we think we know about, which is like corned beef and cabbage is not an Irish invention. Gefilte fish and challah did not originate with the Jews. So she talks about how different kinds of well-known brands of food developed. Breakstone Company, Fleshman Company. She talks about how what happened to the immigrants' food and how it integrated in with general how it became Americanized. And it's a fascinating look at history, social history, through food of different immigrant families. 97 orchard and an edible history of 5 immigrant families in 1 New York tenement. And I myself, I have some family in Manhattan, and I'm going to try to go see the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. It looks fascinating from the pictures in here and from the stories.
Well, that museum's supposed to be very interesting. You see how people lived.
Yep.
Well, food must be, I have a cookbook too I'm going to do later.
Oh, do you? Okay.
And this book is sort of food related because it's by the same author as Eat, Pray, Love. Now, we're filming this on August 11th. The movie opens this week. And the book, Eat, Pray, Love, has been on the bestseller list for 3 or 4 years now.
Yes.
But in case you did not, if you're a fan of that book, in case you didn't know it, Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a sequel called Committed. Right
Don't
here.
give the story away.
A skeptic makes peace with marriage. Now, apparently, I didn't read Eat, Pray, Love. Apparently, at the end of Eat, Pray, Love, her and her boyfriend, is it Felipe, I guess? That's how the book ends. They fall in love. Now, in this book, I can't give too much away because I didn't read it, but apparently what happens is they come back to America, and I think they're both been divorced, and they're both kind of anti-marriage. So they both decide, we're not going to get married. It turns out, though, that her boyfriend is going to be deported or something.
Right. It's
so the only way he can stay is for them to get married. And so this whole book is Elizabeth Gilbert's sort of meditation on marriage and her husband and what they did. And again, the subtitle, I might say it all, A Skeptic Makes Peace with Marriage, because I think she goes through this whole thing, what is marriage, what is it about? She didn't want to do it, but now they're married. I think they're still married. This book came out this year, earlier, January. So that's all I can say about it because I didn't read it. I just read the back here. But.
Well, I will say that Eat, Pray, Love it's a reaction. Her traveling around the world is a reaction to a divorce, a breakup.
Okay.
Her divorce.
Sorry.
So that's.
So this book again is the further adventures of Elizabeth Gilbert and her husband. And it's called Committed: A Skeptic Makes Peace with Marriage. Elizabeth Gilbert is the sequel to Eat, Pray, Love, which opens this week. The day we're filming it.
Right.
So Zina.
My next book is nonfiction. Again, The King's Best Highway: The Lost History of the Boston Post Road, the Route That Made America, by Eric Jaffe. I would pronounce it that way. This is a history, interesting history. It covers what today is U.S. Route 1 and U.S. Route 20 from down in Manhattan to Boston, I guess. The original Boston Post Road originated from the bottom of Manhattan, the lower part of Manhattan, and divided up near New Haven, Connecticut into to make a circle to meet in Boston. And so this is a history of that pathway and everything that happened along it from when it was an Indian path, a Native American path, to today's obviously huge highway. And it tells the history of everything that happened along the way over the decades, hundreds of years, and it does a lot of interesting asides. It presents a lot of interesting asides. It talks about the development of the popularity of bicycles and bicycle travel, and the entrepreneurs involved with developing stagecoaches, and it talks about the cue for this idea of this book was when the author was in the Bronx and he saw a road called the Boston Road. And so he picked up that little bit of detail and tried to find out why it was called the Boston Road.
Okay.
And he talks about that it's called the Boston Post Road because it became a more formal highway when the postal service started in the late 1600s. Not the federal, but the colonists wanted some way to transmit messages, information, and they developed a more formal way to transport post with riders, obviously horseback riders. And so it talks about that, about how they developed the more formal postal system in the United States. And it's just a different way of looking at history in our backyard. The King's Best Highway, The Lost History of the Boston Post Road, The Route That Made America. Joe?
Okay, well, here's a book as part of a series that hopefully I'll be able to explain well. There's a website called edge.org, edge.org, and it's this website where a lot of today's leading thinkers in every field, a lot of them are scientists, but they talk about ideas. They don't necessarily talk about science per se. They talk about ideas on anything you can think of. It's an amazing website. And it was started by John Brockman. And some of the people who are part of this Edge are people, I'll name some, that you'll know the names immediately: Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Ian McEwan, Steven Pinker, Dean Ornish, Paul Davies is a famous string theorist. Let's see, Sam Harris. It's scientists and people interested in the humanities, and it's really a website for ideas. So for the last 3 or 4 years, John Brockman poses a question to all of them, and then he puts them together in a book. And what I was going to say was, each of these are only anywhere from 1 to 3 pages long, so they're very short. And this is the new one. It's called This Will Change Everything, Ideas That Will Shape the Future. But to give you an idea of how it's set up is, for the last 4 years, he asked all these people a question, and they all write this tiny short essay, 1 to 3 pages. And we have all the other books in our library. They're very interesting to look at. One was, what we believe but cannot prove. So all these people wrote a little essay. The next one was called, What is Your Dangerous Idea? The next one was, What are you optimistic about? Last year's book was, What have you changed your mind about? And like I say, all these people write these little essays. So this is the new one, This Will Change Everything. The question was, what will change everything? What game-changing scientific ideas and developments do you expect to live to see? So, as I just said, some of the names I just mentioned, they write, let's see, Richard Dawkins writes a little thing called Breaking the Species Barrier. Steven Pinker writes a thing called Personal Genomes, or maybe not. Dean Ornish, I think, is a famous nutritionist.
Yes.
Our genes are not our fate. Alan Alda is in here. I think Alan Alda is in here because, as you know, if you watch the Science Channel, he does all those shows.
He does science.
And the things range from DNA, gene, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of little essays about the brain, how the brain is going to be changing, or I'm sorry, not changing, what they think will happen to the brain that could change everything. And of course, there's an essay in here, Nothing Will Change Anything, which is kind of funny. I'll read just a couple more.
And the more things change, the...
Yes, Anton Zelinger, I don't know him, his little essay is called The Breakdown of All Computers. That would obviously change everything. And there's several here about the climate. Climate will change everything. There's one here called Green Oil.
Green oil.
It's probably obviously something to do with
Olive oil.
alternative energy. Lisa Randall is a very famous physicist, I think, and hers is Coordinated Computational Power Will Change Science. There's one here called The End of Analytical Science. There's one here called, somebody writes about how they think if we could ever do this, it would change everything. Communication brain to brain, that probably would change everything.
Yeah.
And then let's see, and a couple more. Richard Sapolsky, he's a very famous primatologist. His is called People Who Can Intuit in 6 Dimensions. I'm not sure what that is.
6 dimensions, huh?
So Freeman Dyson is in here. He's a famous astronomer. One person writes an essay. It's just called Africa. I'm not sure what that means, but, and I'm going to end with this one because I find this one really interesting. Sam Harris, I think he's famous for writing Letter to a Christian Nation, and he wrote another book. His little essay is called True Lie Detection, and this is what he writes. I think this is really interesting. He says, deception commends itself, perhaps even above violence, as the principal enemy of human cooperation. Imagine how our world would change if, when the truth really mattered, it became impossible to lie. I love that one. Then he writes a little essay on it. So, this is from the edge.org people. It's 125 people with these 2 to 3 page essays on that question, and a wide range of thinkers. What they think, if it could happen, would just change everything. This will change everything. So,
the more things change, the more things remain the same.
yes, that is true. I think there was one in here like there's one in here like that.
It's more like human nature never changes. I think.
But these very
what-
interesting extrapolations view on
Yes.
things.
Sounds fascinating.
Okay.
All right. My next book is a history book. It's a true story. The Great Divorce, a 19th century mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her time. So it has some local interest. It's the author's last name is Woo, W-O-O, and her first name is Ilyan, which is very interesting. I thought her name was interesting. This just appeared on my desk this morning. I think it's going to be of interest to many of you in this area because it is about the Shakers in our backyard. It's about the story of a marriage, a woman trying to get her children back from her husband, who, when their marriage was dissolving, took their children away from her and kind of hid out in the Shaker community in our backyard. And it's about the legal battle that ensued. This was in the 1800s, early 1800s, and of course women didn't have much say about anything in a marriage at that time. And they make a point of saying that even though the Shakers at that time felt that the children belonged to the husband at that point, the book does clarify that the Shakers themselves believed in gender equality. So the book is largely about Eunice Chapman. That's Eunice Chapman's efforts to get her children back from her husband, who was in effect hiding out with the Shakers, and he embraced the Shakers' philosophy of life and religion. But it talks about it relates her legal struggles, and I guess she was quite a woman. She wrote a lot. She wrote for the newspapers and the magazines of the time, and she personally talked and had meetings with very important people in the state legislature and at the state level. Eventually, well, maybe, I guess I was deciding whether or not to tell you the end of the story, but she does prevail, but because so many societal influences and legal influences were against her bid for getting her children back, it's apparently quite a tale that's being told. So it's something I didn't know about. Perhaps there's people in this area who know about this Eunice Chapman and James Chapman and their legal battle. But it tells quite a bit about the Shakers and the New York political scene then as well in the early 1800s. So you may be hearing a lot more about this book in the future. The Great Divorce, a 19th century mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her times, by Ilyan Woo. Joe?
Okay, now here's a book. If you're a fan of the James Bond movies, this is sort of a history of the movies, but not just a straight how they made the movie. It's called The Man with the Golden Touch. How the Bond films conquered the world. Sinclair McKay, I think he's from England. I'm not 100% sure. Yes, he's from England. The book is really it's about all the films, sort of a history of it, how they came about, all the different people who were in them, but it's really about, from what I can gather, about the movies as sort of a pop culture. You know, James Bond is an iconic sort of figure. And the book is also about how the movies change with the times, how they reflect the times. And it is a lot about how they made the movies and everything, but it got really, I read about 5 reviews, all great reviews. Obviously, you got to be a fan of the Bond movies too. I think it's been 22 or 23 over the last 48 years, I think. So it starts with, 62 with Dr. No and up to 2006, the new version of Casino Royale. So if you're interested in the James Bond movies, this book got really good reviews. Like again, it's mainly the Bond movies as pop culture, I guess you could say. The Man with the Golden Touch, How the Bond Films Conquered the World by Sinclair McKay. Really good reviews it got. Zina?
To mix things up a little bit, because we tend to bring nonfiction books to your attention more than fiction, this just came in, this fiction. It's a debut novel, a first novel by this author by the name of Emily St. John Mandel. Now, maybe it's Emily St. John Mandel. I don't know how they pronounce it correctly. But it's called Last Night in Montreal. And it's kind of a suspense novel. It's about a woman who tends not to stay in one place for very long, and she tends to disappear frequently. And the novel opens with her most current disappearance, and it provides going through the story while her boyfriend tries to find her and try to figure out why she has this pattern of disappearing throughout her life, and his interviews per se with people in her past. It provides a backstory, just that, about what her life was like, her early life was like, and why she feels the need to just pick up and go frequently in her life. And it's written very cleverly, and I already read the first chapter, just getting ready for this show, and it's gotten good reviews. It was actually published a year ago, and I'm just beginning to see the reviews, and it's showing up on different kinds of lists that we as librarians look at. So I think it's probably going to be a bestseller in the future. Last Night in Montreal by Emily St. John Mandel.
Okay, you're right, Zina. We don't seem to pick fiction as much, but I have one here too. So I'll follow your fiction with a fiction. This is one of the latest from the Library of America. This is I've mentioned this before. These are uniform editions of the America's greatest authors. This is the collected stories of Raymond Carver, a hugely influential short story writer in the 70s and 80s. If you're interested in the short story, or if you just like short stories, you love this book. But this collects all his stories in his books. Will You Be Quiet, Please? What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, Cathedral, and then selected stories from some of his other books. But the interesting thing is, Raymond Carver really, some would say, revolutionized the short story in America in the 70s. Like I say, hugely influential. He came along the same time with, I'm thinking of people like Ann Beatty, and Bobby Ann Mason. They were sort of known as the minimalist school. Raymond Carver's also been called the dirty realist because he writes a lot about people sort of down in their luck or maybe in the lower socioeconomic classes, living paycheck to paycheck. So he started this whole movement, I guess you could say, but hugely influential. But the thing that's interesting about this collection is after Raymond Carver died, his most famous book, the book that made him famous to start with, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, it turns out that the original manuscript came out and the stories were a lot longer and not as sparse, and he was known for this sparse style. So this whole controversy broke out, and actually someone wrote a whole book about it. Was the genius Raymond Carver, or was it his editor, Gordon Lish? So this book puts in the book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, the version we know, but it puts the original in too, before all the editing, so you can sort of see what happened. I mean, Raymond Carver did go on to still write beautifully, and he was a great short story writer. So I don't know, it turns out, this stuff about Gordon Lish, I don't know, but they were heavily edited. So there is something about what made Raymond Carver Raymond Carver. Gordon Lisher himself. So that's kind of interesting if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But if you just want to read great short stories, and a hugely influential short story writer from the 70s and 80s, Raymond Carver. This is his collected stories, Library of America. Zina?
Okay, this is our show number 12. The previous show, show number 11, which we taped last week, we highlighted titles that we got as recommendations from the library staff. It could be any kind of a book that they liked when they were young, a book that they just read that they highly recommended. So our show was all about titles that the staff had recommended. And there were a couple that I failed to get copies of, hard copies that I could hold up for people to see, and I wanted to bring them to your attention as well, that library staff recommended.
And that's a new book too.
This is new book, and it's a first. it's a novel.
A three fiction.
And it's a first novel by someone. It's called Major Pettigrew's Last Stand, and it's set in the English countryside, but it's contemporary, and it's kind of old, change that's coming to the small village in the English countryside. And the person who recommended it said it was a quick summer read, delightful vocabulary, sentence structure, and plot, refreshing. And I've read most of it. I haven't gotten to the end. And it's a story about an old school Major Pettigrew, who's a widow, a recent widower, right? Widower,
yes,
retired, and his ensuing relationship with a Pakistani tea shop owner in the village, and it's very it's cute. It's comfortable, easy reading, but it's clever as well, and it's about all the forces that they have to fight against to have any kind of relationship in this old school world, and about their new, his son, Major Pettigrew's son, and the effort to sell property off in someone's estate nearby. It's just really cute and clever and a really nice read, and it's getting really good reviews.
I was going to say that book's getting excellent reviews, and a few people I know that read that loved it.
Yes, it's a really good, nice read. Major Pettigrew's Last Stand. But I have a second book, and our director didn't know I was going to do this, so I wanted to mention this other book that was recommended, and this is nonfiction. It's a memoir by Oliver W. Sacks, who is a renowned neurologist, neuroscientist.
Yes.
And the name of the book is Uncle Tungsten, Memories of a Chemical Boyhood. And it's Oliver Sacks, who has apparently written other stories about his interest in his cases, that's right, his neurology cases. And he talks about the influences of, in particular, his uncle, who was had a tungsten filament manufacturing plant, I think in the early 1900s. I think that's right. And this is in England. And he talks about his family, they were very educated and very scientific people, a lot of doctors, a lot of scientists, and his becoming enthralled with all things science, in particular chemistry. So in a way, this is a story, a history of chemistry, as he was exposed to it in his formative years. Apparently, in his teenage years, he became enthralled with biology and thus became a doctor, a medical doctor. But in his early years, he was fascinated with chemistry. And so anyone who'd like to read about how one develops into a scientist might like to read this. It also is an easy read, and the person who recommended it says her husband has read it a couple of times and absolutely adores it. Uncle Tungsten by Oliver Sacks.
Well, he's a wonderful writer, if you've ever read his essays.
And I haven't, so.
Yes, he's really good.
Okay, Joe?
Well, I didn't get to my cookbook or my book about the Crusades, but maybe next time. I'm going to just end with this. We're filming this on August 11th, so this will be on August and September. Don't forget Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. During the month of October, we have these little brochures around the library. During the month of October, we're going to have several programs devoted to this book. You can sign up for one of 3 different book discussion groups if you want to come to. We're going to have one during the day, one at night, and one on a Sunday afternoon. So hopefully people can make that. We're going to have a program for teens. We're going to have a genealogy program where we are having people coming from the Plymouth Plantation over in Massachusetts. They're going to come and do a presentation, the original Plymouth Plantation. We're going to have our noon book review. It's going to be on this book, and our reviewer is going to be Professor Jennifer Dorsey from Siena, and she runs the Siena College Center for Revolutionary Era Studies. She's going to give us a review, and we're going to have a movie. Look for these around the library. We have a big display downstairs with hundreds of copies of this. I think we've already had a couple hundred checkouts, so everyone watching, there's plenty of copies here. Look for that. So that is it for this time, and we'll see you next time on So Many Books, So Little Time.